I'm Dwayne Schultes, and on this Vital Health podcast, I'm speaking with Blythe Adamson, the head of Outcomes Research and Evidence Generation at Flatiron Health. Initially funded by Google and launched in 2012, news of Flatiron's $1.9 billion acquisition by Roche in 2018 delivered a pressing message that real-world data and evidence would have a central role in drug discovery moving forward. Blythe, it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been working with my colleague Petra Naster on a project in Europe, Trials at Home, and she speaks very highly of you, and it's the first time we met. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm so happy to be here.
So from what I've read, you joined Flatiron Health very early on in the start of the company in 2018, right around the time they were acquired by Roche. How has the approach since that time developed in drug discovery? How are you guys evolving?
Well, so much of when I joined Flatiron was still a dream. We had data sets available in a few different cancer types, and really we were relying a lot on the manual labor of opening up charts one by one.
Oh, wow.
And over the years, through this effort of, oncology nurses and teams of oncologists, software engineers, biostatisticians, epidemiologists, we really were able to evolve and grow and build both the scale and clinical depth to be able to understand safety and effectiveness of new medicines in real time.
Now, you have a laser-like focus specifically on oncology and only oncology. Why do you target that clinical area specifically?
Well, it's a great question because many other groups have tried to do this at a broader level, being able to curate and have real-world data sets that can answer research questions in many different diseases. And often when I've analyzed them in the past, it's difficult to have the clinical depth that you need to apply things like the inclusion and exclusion criteria of a clinical trial. So there's a trade-off in trying to be broad and cover all diseases versus going deep to the level that's sufficient for regulatory grade decision making. And Flatiron has made a purposeful choice to strive for excellence and rigor and the depth and quality necessary to be able to answer questions for regulatory, HTA, market access decisions.
And essentially then Roche with the Genentech acquisition as well, right around the same time, a little earlier. But obviously Genentech is well known for biologics targeting oncology. So it seems there's quite a seamless relationship there in that sense.
Yes, and Flatiron has maintained an independent affiliate position with Roche. So with firewalls, it's really all of the life science companies that we partner with have equal access and opportunity to benefit from our data and our services.
So you can work for competitors of Roche, and there's no restrictions or problems for doing so? There's not a right of first refusal or anything like that?
No, and I think that that's actually one of the assets that has helped us maintain the true position of being non-biased towards any specific company. So, for example, when we're developing the treatment line of therapy rules, we're not doing it with a specific manufacturer's drug in mind, but rather having leading oncologists who understand clinical care, being the ones that will design fit for purpose, business rules and logic and policies and procedures for abstraction that are trustworthy for decision making and not leaning towards one specific company or another. So I think it's a strength that we work with so many different groups.
But you also collect the data, right? I mean, you also house your own data. So when you say firewalls, that would also go then to the housing and warehousing of the real world evidence that you keep. So you sort of become almost a curator for all your clients as well.
Yes. So 75% so Flatiron's network within the U.S. has more than 4 million patients with cancer.
Okay.
And about 3/4 of that comes from community oncology clinics that are using Flatiron's OncoEMR EHR software. And 25%, the other quarter of these patients come from academic medical centers. Now, those centers are often running on Epic or on Cerner, so they require data integrations for us to have real-time insights.
Which is always so smooth.
Yeah, always so smooth.
Always so smooth.
But that's really what we learned from, rather than expanding to different disease areas, expanding to different countries.
Right.
And so now that we're beginning to curate EHR data sets in the UK and Germany and Japan, we really learned from the academic integrations with Epic and Cerner in the United States to be able to enable the way that we designed data integrations in other parts of the world.
I'd like to go back a little bit just to this focus on oncology, just because we're seeing such a big, how do I say this? Sort of, we're partying like it's 1999 again with cardiovascular disease. We're seeing a huge pull. Our firm, we think, and we've presented data to this all the time, we think this has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act and the disincentives. Are you seeing any pulls or moves with the over 65 population due to this in oncology? Are you seeing this, anything in your data?
Well, we haven't seen this yet because Flatiron's data represents standard of care practice. So early on at this point, we're only able to detect market trends in drugs that are already approved.
Sure.
So I think, but soon, within the next several years, then I'm sure we'll start to see signals for these changes.
I mean, we are picking up, look at all the combination radiotherapeutics that you're starting to see now. I mean, that takes a small molecule and pushes it into the device area. It does seem there's some, I don't want to say clever by half, but it does seem like there's some strategic choices being made in asset delivery to try and sidestep some of the small molecule pill penalty, as it's called, in IRA. I mean, are you seeing this as well with your clients, the sort of radiotherapeutics and a lot of these more exotic treatments starting to come back into the fold?
I haven't looked into that research question yet specifically, but I think it's a really good one we should start answering.
Okay. So one of the big focuses that Flatiron's had, particularly under your leadership on this project, is looking at AI. Now, AI is a buzzword. We're in the Gartner hype cycle, all this stuff. And I know I used to work with IBM quite a bit as a client when they had their Watson platform. Now, Watson was, Dr. Watson, and all this was put into the market in the early 2000s, and it didn't succeed. It kind of failed miserably, actually. And it was a big shot for a lot of us who'd worked with this because we thought it was going to have a lot of potential. What are you doing differently? How is your AI different from what happened in Watson? Why are you guys succeeding where others are failing?
Well, Flatiron has really experimented with and pioneered and applied AI, ML in several different areas. So similar to what you're describing with Watson, we have developed point-of-care AI-enabled tools. We've also developed and deployed its use in recruitment for clinical trials.
That's interesting.
And then also in scaling our extraction of clinical data elements from patients' charts for building real-world data sets more efficiently. And for our point of care tool, I was a part of this team that built this, and it was really in response to hearing our network of nurses talk about the burden that they had in their clinical workflows. And so one of the first tools that we built was really designed to listen. After listening to nurses, building a tool to help them identify, who are the 50 patients that I should be calling this week to assess for extra at-home care services. So it was really incorporating it into workflow to improve the efficiency of care. And this is something that we've published, both the retrospective and prospective validation of that tool in Nature. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, there's a few other things that I really want to dig into here, particularly the recruitment side. Because recruitment is such a huge challenge. If you talk to people who do this for real, clinical research, they're spending they put aside $200,000, $300,000 a patient for a cancer trial, for example. So you get really expensive very quickly. How does your tool specifically help with recruitment for clinical trials?
So not only can we very easily now identify sites that would be optimal for a clinical trial, and in looking at diversity and prevalence of different biomarker or subgroups. Now, that's not necessarily AI. Those are things that we can just find through data analysis. But the AI is able to help us process a lot of the documents that are hidden within patients' records that may contain key information about that patient's eligibility for a clinical trial. And by incorporating that into tools and integration into the EHR, it's now possible to create flags for a physician or, a clinic coordinator saying, okay, this person's about to come in for a visit in 2 weeks, and we have this new flag that this patient may be eligible now for a new clinical trial.
And what you're talking about then is also the AI tapping into the process workflow and saying, okay, they're going to be in town, they're going to be here, so we may be able to hit them for a clinical research portfolio or something.
Yes.
So that's really interesting.
A novel, prediction of something. It's really using AI to more efficiently process all of the trillions of pages of documents that we have access to surface insights that you could have found through opening up patients' charts and reading through the entire thing manually. And I think that's also the key of what makes AI ML applications at Flatiron possible, is that because we have access to all of the source data, and we can still and do still have our expert humans open up charts, we can validate that these models are working properly and do quality assurance in all of the different ways that we're enabling it.
And a lot of that really good information is often buried in the doctor's notes, the unstructured data.
Yes.
Obviously, the ICD-10 and the structured data, sure, you can pull that. But often then when you're trying to interpret some of that or you're trying to look for a clinical change, that's in the notes. How are you dealing with the free text, the unstructured data? How does your AI apply to that?
Yeah, so before LLMs came along, Flatiron had spent years building many different deep learning models to be able to extract information like the metastatic diagnosis date or their biomarker status. And this is what allowed us to go from being able to learn from the experience of more than 300,000 patients that we've manually curated to now be able to learn from the 4 million patients that we really have access to their documents to be able to learn from. So an example, just to illustrate the scale of this, is that we had a cohort of 70,000 lung cancer patients that we had, the FDA had alerted us that there was a drug that was approved and on the market may have a signal of it not being as safe and effective in a subgroup of patients that were positive for a biomarker called KRAS.
Okay.
So we spent, 3 months and thousands of hours opening up 70,000 patient charts to look within, the PDF that's 50 pages long and a complex genomic testing report to find that piece of information. Are they positive or negative for this? And as soon as we were done, then we find out, well, actually, the new thing they've discovered is that it's the G12C mutation within the KRAS biomarker. So what are we going to do? Go through, spend all this time going through it again? Instead, we were able to more efficiently deploy a deep learning model that was trained to be able to pull out that specific mutation information. And in less than a day, we were able to identify the 13,000 patients that were positive for that specific mutation and saved more than 3,000 hours of an abstractor's time to in the months it would take to open up the charts. So to me, really that means the timeliness and the scale that you're able to get actionable insights is quickly evolving. And now, just at ASCO last week, we presented one of our new techniques of using fine-tuned LLMs similarly. And we showed using fine-tuning Llama and Mistral for the task of going through and finding PD-L1 positivity and percent staining from images and these complex reports. So really, this is an automation of human tasks that is, easily for us to be able to validate, because Flatiron has more than a decade of labeling manually all of these patient charts.
And so then, because you have you have the reservoir of data and the knowledge about how you're labeling them, you've been able to layer over this with your own proprietary AI that learns from what you've learned, I guess.
Yes.
If that's the shorthand of how this was worked.
Yes, exactly.
So I'd like to dig into a little bit about the network that you mentioned earlier. So you have community health, home health, you have practical oncology units, and you have teaching hospitals. How does that work? How do you manage that from an administrative standpoint? Obviously, you've grown immensely from where you were in 2018. How do you see the incorporation of these various partners, and how do you actually collaborate practically?
Yeah. Well, I'm one side of our of the Flatiron Health company is healthcare and ensuring that we're delivering software tools that are enabling community clinics to deliver the best care possible. But really, cancer patients are seen in lots of different types of places, and if we want to be able to understand how well their treatments are working, then we need to be able to capture all of the perspectives that document those experiences. And that's why it's interesting, it's different in each of the countries where we curate data sets. So in the UK, our partners are with NHS trusts that capture many different sides of the cancer care continuum. In Germany, we partner with both networks of clinics and academic hospitals. And then in Japan, with large cancer centers that are offering care to a majority of the population. So in each country, it's been an incredible learning experience to understand how cancer care differs in different countries and who you need to partner with in each of those countries to be able to get the data to inform high quality comparative effectiveness research.
One of the big challenges of working in Europe is that a lot of the data is often housed in individual academic units who have these sort of, I don't want to say fiefdoms, but they've sort of carved out these castles of clinical data and clinical research that they sort of own in an almost regal stature. And you have to cut individual deals with those doctors. Do you see that culture changing, or is it just endemic because of the fact the way Europe works? Often these people are bureaucrats and they're sort of politicians in many levels because they're associated with the local political organizations. So how do you get around those culture changes for creating a usage of AI that goes broader for health data than just in this silo? How do you deal with that cultural problem?
Well, let's separate it into two things. There's the spirit of what I see countries wanting, and then the technical infrastructure to allow that to happen. I do see movement towards the spirit of what people want is to learn from the experiences of patients in their country, while also protecting their privacy and the security of health data in a responsible way. And, I think that that's incredible and amazing. Now, the implementing the technical infrastructure to be able to do that in a way that is compliant with local laws and regulations is very hard and challenging. And it took Flatiron years to be able to do this in Europe. And it requires levels of anonymizing patient data and then de-identifying it at several different points to be able to preserve the privacy and security of this type of health data. But I would say what we've been able to overcome and prove is possible now is that within trusted research environments, we can now combine patient-level data from different countries in a harmonized way to now do analyses of treatment patterns and comparative effectiveness with patient-level data combined from many countries, which is not something I've been able to see before.
Now, is that federated? So you're doing the work at the national level, or are you actually able to bring that data in?
We are able to bring it in. That is really the
that's
victory
kind of the
of the
secret. Yeah, that's the secret sauce, because that's been really hard to do.
It has been hard to do, but it does unlock so many more methodological options for rigorous analysis when you're able to combine patient-level data across those countries. And I would say another part is the power of Flatiron curating these data sets from scratch is that we're building them to be fit for purpose for comparative effectiveness analysis. So when we look at things like defining what does the variable for disease progression mean, or what's a complete response mean? We have oncologists within each of these countries working together so that the variables have concept validity, so that we can combine them together in studies rather than, having one country defines it this way, another defines it this way. But healthcare systems and the ways that physicians treat patients do differ between countries. And so it's just been really fascinating to see how our team has worked together to overcome those obstacles.
And one of the big challenges then is, say, for example, if you're working on an early stage orphan treatment and you say, we want PFS, we want progression-free survival, there is no real definition country by country of how you define progression-free survival in a real-world data set. So it's almost like you end up fighting. We're not fighting or pitching. Yeah,
we had
exactly.
to build a common data model.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is where I'd say, you mentioned this at the very beginning, why stay just in cancer?
Yeah.
And I think this is where excellence can happen by just focusing on one thing and trying to do it really well.
No, I get that. My only concern is the sand is sort of shifting now because we've disincentivized the Onca portfolio so much. I mean, obviously there's still going to be research there, but just look at the cardiovascular drugs are just booming, the anti-obesity drugs, and we'll have to see what happens there. That's all. It's
interesting because my whole career before joining Flatiron was as an infectious disease epidemiologist and economist.
And I'd like to talk to you about that a little bit.
I was just going to say that there were never incentives in infectious diseases for people to be on the cutting edge of figuring out real world data.
Yeah.
And I saw, back in 2017 that, EHR data and all the unstructured data, the people who could figure out how to do that, it's probably going to happen where there's the most financial incentives. And I saw that as being in cancer drugs at the time.
Course.
So really, I still will forever be an HIV researcher at heart, but coming to Flatiron was a really intentional quest for me to be able to learn how to do this and what's possible, because I really believe that Flatiron's discovery of being the pioneer, the first to prove this is possible, will have a spillover benefit to all of these other disease areas for groups to be able to pick up similar practices, and for so much momentum and movement to have been made of even helping regulators, HTA bodies, payers be able to understand what does high quality real world data and evidence look like.
Well, and I'd like to dig into this sort of spirit of your infectious disease background here a little bit, because you, as if you're not busy enough, Blythe, you run something called Infectious Economics LLC. So you actually run a consultancy in this, and you were, I'll say, seconded on some level to the White House during the COVID outbreak. I mean, talk about being in the right place or the wrong place at the right time, or right place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it. I mean, how was that? I mean, that must have been crazy.
Well, I had spent my entire life forecasting pandemics and working in the development of HIV vaccine. Yeah.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
So, I was grateful that something that I had been training my whole life to do, I had the opportunity to help and contribute. It was incredibly intense. I was served as the lead data scientist in the White House, in the West Wing, working and advising the President of the United States and the Pentagon. It was a very intense experience, but I think that all decision makers deserve to have available to them the best quality evidence possible to reduce uncertainty in decision making. And in politics and in government, there are always many inputs that go into a decision. But my hope is that in being a bridge between health and economics is so important for policymakers. And we see this happening again now with bird flu threats.
Yeah.
We can't operate in isolation just optimizing for, I think it's tone deaf to only try to optimize for health and not acknowledge and incorporate the economic impact into decision models.
And I guess that's what we found at our firm so frustrating about the COVID response is all the decisions seemed to be taken in isolation, and no one was looking. I mean, Martin Koldorf and Jay Bhattacharya were, but they were eviscerated in the media for trying to look at this in the holistic approach. And, it just became almost a matter of religion and not data. And what you found is it was often the quants who were more right than the public health people. And I'm sure that must have been very frustrating for you, someone who has your feet in both worlds, who's a data scientist.
Well, it to me was just an opportunity to bridge the gap between two different disciplines. I saw some incredible economists who had doing powerful analyses and regressions and diff and diffs were with high competency in analyzing real world data. And then I also saw health teams that had weaknesses in being able to analyze real world data. But then the economists not understanding how to incorporate the dynamic transmission aspects into their models, and the health team having an opportunity to incorporate, it's not just lives lost. It's also who is unemployment rate, GDP per capita at the end of the year. So what are the consequences of these health policy decisions on, other aspects of human welfare?
Drug addiction, alcoholism, broken families. I mean, lost GDP. For every 1% of GDP, the population mortality rate increases. I mean, there's all these other holistic things that need to be considered, and they can't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah. So behind the scenes in the West Wing, March, April at the time, there were models that did incorporate all of those dimensions and ways that we found to use math modeling to bring together and to help these different groups understand each other. But they even use different languages, like economists and epidemiologists. Sometimes I would sit at a conference room table in the White House and say, like, okay, when she says confounding, it means endogeneity, and they kind of throw their hands in there. Oh, why didn't they just say that? Or, so it's just helping two different disciplines understand each other.
So we're in this Gartner hype cycle. Obviously, from what you're saying, you seem confident that you've got your AI working and everything's going to be super fantastic and wonderful. There's no problems. Where do you think we're going to be 5 years from now? I mean, how much of this world is going to change that we see here sitting on the stage and on the floor at Bio?
Well, I think that there are many different applications of AI in drug development that can happen at different times within the life cycle of product development. And I've talked to you about some applications that I think have been successful because of the opportunity to validate them in real time and do retrospective and prospective validation. But I think at Bio specifically, there are a lot of companies here that are using AI for identifying targets, for selecting molecules. And I think that it will take us 5 years, 10 years to be able to validate whether companies that chose the strategy of having AI-informed product selection versus companies that did not, for that to actually prove out. We have to wait all the way to see who has more successful trials at the end. So I'm looking forward to 5 to 10 years from now to see, is this really going to help accelerate innovation at the discovery stage?
Yeah. Well, Blythe, it's been really fascinating getting a chance to speak with you. Again, Petra, my business partner, speaks incredibly highly of you, and it's a real pleasure, and I wish you all success.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. The executive producer of the Vital Health podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Gwen O'Laughlin. The Vital Health podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2024.